Hello, folks. This is Arman with Metaspike. Thanks for joining. It is about 11 o'clock, so let's get this started. If you cannot hear me, please send me a note on the chat so I know that there's some issue with the audio. I'm assuming that all is well. So today, my plan is to do a power user webinar. So this is one of those events we set up regularly to catch everybody up on what's going on with Forensic Email Collector, some of the new functionality we released recently, answer some of your questions and address any issues you might have. So today's agenda is essentially a few things. Graph API, this is Microsoft's new API that we introduced recently. What you can do with it, what are some of the differences compared to Exchange Web Services and other options we have. We'll go over metadata-only acquisitions. We'll talk about Gmail history records, how to acquire them, how to interpret them. We will talk about Gmail message ID and thread ID timestamps, and I'll leave some time for any questions you might have. So let's start with Graph API. So let me share my screen with you here. All right, so you should be seeing my screen with the black background with the Metaspike logo on there. So let's fire up FEC, and I'll start by showing you the providers that we have available right now. So let's put in my email address and I'll switch. So you can use this hyperlink at the top right corner to switch profiles. So you can use the different provider types for that email account. So I'll click that to show you what we have right now. So as you see, we have 5 different provider types at the moment. We have Gmail API for Gmail and G Suite. We have Exchange Web Services, which is mainly for on-premises Exchange servers and Office 365. We have Graph API, which is new, that covers both Office 365 and Microsoft's consumer accounts like Hotmail and Outlook.com and Live and MSN. We have IMAP for a lot of providers that don't support API-based access, and we have POP3 as a last resort if you can't have anything else to connect to a server. So you'll notice that there's a little bit of overlap between Exchange Web Services and Graph API in that they can both target Office 365. So when we first released Graph API, the perception from a lot of you was that Graph API was meant to replace Exchange Web Services, and that isn't so, at least for the time being. So I'll start by talking about those two first and the differences. Graph API is Microsoft's new API that's kind of a unified application programming interface that brings together their mail, OneDrive, a lot of administrative interfaces, Teams, and lots of other data points. So that's like a combined API to access lots of Microsoft services. And they've been putting a lot of effort and their time into developing Graph API, whereas Exchange Web Services hasn't been improved all that much in the past few years. So I think it's safe to say that Exchange Web Services is kind of in the back burner, and the focus is now on Graph API. Now, why are we not switching all of our Office 365 acquisitions to Exchange to Graph API yet? That's because Graph API is not as complete for Exchange as Exchange Web Services is. There are a few things that are missing. Number one, it doesn't give you access to the in-place archive, but I think that that's coming pretty soon. In terms of the granular data you can get, you don't have all the data points that you can get from Exchange Web Services. For example, when you connect with Exchange Web Services, you have access to a whole host of underlying mapping properties, different item types like sticky notes and contacts and calendar items and a lot of other things. Whereas in Graph API, those are, to the extent available, there are different APIs, for example, for calendar, and some item types are just not available at all. So it doesn't have the same coverage as Exchange Web Services. So that's why by default, when you do an Office 365 or Exchange acquisition with FEC, it'll use Exchange Web Services for now. So to compare the two APIs, Graph API is a RESTful API, so it's more along the lines of Gmail API in how it works. Whereas Exchange Web Services is SOAP based, so it's more, instead of JSON, it has XML payloads, and it's more of a legacy API, so to speak. So let's do a couple of things to show you some of the differences and some of the benefits of Graph API and why we took the time to build it in the first place. So when we connect to, for example, my Office 365 account here, like as you see here, by default, FEC will select Exchange Web Services, and it'll have this use auth option selected. That's because a lot of providers are actually moving away from legacy authentication. So modern is the way to go. So we'll select that by default. I'll skip over these details for now. So when you log in, you'll see that this dialog will pop up. This is kind of similar to what we had before for Exchange, but now this is a unified architecture for both Graph and Exchange Web Services. So you'll see the same dialog for both of those options. I'll just choose my Office 365 account. So this is when I log into my mailbox through Exchange Web Services. You'll see that there's a whole host of folders here. We covered this before, but just for the sake of comparison. So on the bottom of the mailbox, we have this recoverable items root. Again, we talked about this before, but this covers things like the double deleted items, discovery holds, and a lot of other things. And then right above it, there's this whole area that's the archive root. So this is the exchange in place archive. These are the items that have been moved away from the main inbox to a separate archive mailbox. It's associated with the main mailbox, and you don't get access to this over IMAP or over Graph API for the time being. So this is something that's a differentiator, and it's kind of a big deal for now. And then on the top, you have the regular mailbox folders. And again, you'll see that you have folders like calendar, contacts, Teams chat, which is the Microsoft Teams messages and conversations, and then the regular mail folders like inbox and stuff. So here, I'm going to touch on a few things based on some conversations I've had with some of you, so I can clarify a few things while we're at this exchange point. One of them is the audits folder. This comes up quite a bit, and this is a system folder that email clients are not allowed to access. So we let FEC throw an exception there just because it is an error and we want to document that. But before, that was also triggering retry attempts. So because that folder could not be acquired, or a snapshot of it could not be acquired, FEC would go back and retry it multiple times. Now in the latest release in 351, we record that as a system folder and as a permanent error, so we don't go back and retry. So that cuts down some unnecessary retries and acquisition time. Going back up here, you'll see that at the very top of this archive root, which is the in-place archive, like I said, there's a folder called All Items. So the All Items folder, it's not super well documented, but there's some information on this from Microsoft. And let me see if I can pull up one of their support articles about this. So you can read this article about the All Items folder. I'll post a link to this later, perhaps in the community. But the bottom line is, this is typically an Outlook created search folder. So essentially it pulls items that are the mail type items from multiple different folders within the mailbox. And the reasoning for this is searches in Exchange are folder based. So when you run an in-place search on Exchange or Office 365, you'll see that it's going folder by folder and executing the same search on multiple folders. Whereas in Gmail, you run a search and boom, it runs on the entire mailbox. So one downside of this is time. It takes longer to search, let's say in this case, 150 mail folders rather than just run a search across the board. So to make this a little bit more seamless, Outlook creates a search folder that unifies those subfolders within the mailbox and puts them in one place. But the downside of this is it could create a single folder that's really large and a duplicate of some other items. For example, in my mailbox here, this All Items folder has 4,732 items, and it is actually an exact replica of what you would find under this top information store folder and its subfolder. So essentially my archived inbox and its whole folder tree. So that's something to pay attention to, and you should do your own testing, but in some cases, it might be appropriate to not search that folder, for example, because you could have an all items folder here that consists of hundreds of thousands of items. So that's something to pay attention to. And you may not see this in every mailbox. It's Outlook behavior, so just watch out for that, see if you have that. And then at the top, we have the regular mailbox folders. Something else that I should point out is that there is also a special folder called person metadata in some mailboxes. You might see this in the main mailbox, as well as under the archive folder or in the recoverable items folder. And this is, per Microsoft's documentation, used by the add-in that they have called Outlook Customer Manager. So it's kind of a CRM system that's built into Outlook, or let's say it used to be, but I think they're moving away from that now and discontinuing it. But the important thing is, for completeness, FEC acquires the contents of this folder, but the messages you would find inside are partial and skeleton messages that are used for the internal workings of Outlook Customer Manager. And they're not complete messages, so don't be thrown off. And you see those, perhaps, in this case, a couple thousand items that don't really look like anything. The reason we acquire them and not skip them is that they have some information sometimes about contact, and just the presence of such an item could be a clue in an investigation, such as somebody having dealings with somebody else, for instance. So because it's available, we capture it, but just so you know, that's a different type of data point. It's not regular emails. So now that we looked at this mailbox through Exchange Web Services, let's look at the same mailbox through Graph API. You can do that a couple of ways. Probably the easiest way is to hit this hyperlink here. So you see that we have two hyperlinks here, one to switch over to IMAP and one to switch over to Graph API now. Or alternatively, you could go back and do this switch profile thing and choose Graph API from here, or anything else for that matter. But I'll just choose this Graph API option. So it switched over to a different type of provider here, but the target mailbox is still the same. I'll just proceed here and look at what we have in the mailbox. Again, the login will be about the same way. Now, you'll notice right away that now that I'm logged in with Graph API, I'm looking at the same mailbox, but the contents are a lot more brief. So it's an abbreviated version of the mailbox in a way. The recoverable items folder is still there, so you can have access to still the same deletions and all that stuff that's here. But the mailbox itself is a lot more abbreviated. And you see that you have all the mail related items here, but not necessarily the other item types or all the crazy folders that you would find in Exchange or the in-place archive. And also, you don't have the capabilities to do an enterprise acquisition with impersonation or delegation, at least for the time being. So for Exchange, well, for Office 365, this could be helpful in some ways. For example, you could have a case where you're primarily interested in emails that are in the main mailbox, and searching in Graph API could be faster than searching in Exchange Web Services. But like I said, that's the exception. Most of the time you would want to go with Exchange Web Services for Office 365. Now, the main appeal of Graph API for now is Microsoft's consumer accounts, because if you're targeting something like a Outlook.com account, previously we would go through IMAP to tackle that. Now you can do Graph API for this, and this has many benefits. Number one, it allows a much richer search interface along the lines of Exchange and Gmail API. So you're not stuck with searching using IMAP syntax or limited IMAP search capabilities. The other big thing is module authentication. So you can use FEC Remote Authenticator to get an authentication token from an end user and not having to learn their password, or work around two-factor authentication pretty easily. Oh, I selected the wrong email account there. talking too much. I didn't pay attention just a second. So let's sign in as this user. All right, so we logged into the FEC Dev at Outlook.com account. So this is an Outlook.com, so Microsoft consumer account. We logged in through Remote Authentication. One of the things I said, the biggest differentiators is the search capabilities. So you'll see that we have the Gmail API style search box here. You can get the syntax help on this here, which is mainly Microsoft's documentation that we refer you to. So you can learn about the KQL syntax reference and all the search operators and things you can use here, but it's pretty comprehensive. One of the differences that could throw you off is that the date searches are slightly different when you specify the before and after date ranges, so pay attention to that. We have Query Builder, which will do that for you. So if you specify dates here, you'll see that it'll use the right syntax and construct their searches. We also have the same load from file user interface here that you can load a list of terms and execute them in Graph API like you do with Exchange and Gmail API. The second big thing is, and this is kind of huge, you have access to the recoverable items folder. So before, when we did Microsoft consumer accounts through IMAP, so any Hotmail or Outlook.com or Live.com or MSN acquisition, we would go through IMAP and we didn't have access to double deleted items. If an item was single deleted and put in the trash, then you could access it from the deleted items folder here. But if it was double deleted and really gone, you didn't have access to it. Now with Graph API, it is here under deletions. And you can, if you're just interested in those, you can just grab the deletions and charge ahead. And in this case, this is an item that I had recently double deleted. So I had created this earlier, and the creation date is here at around 10:13 a.m. And I double deleted that and put that in the recoverable items folder. So there is something that's pretty appealing, that you can recover those deleted items like you would with Exchange. And another thing that you can do is to get the mailbox filters. So if the user had set up some inbox rules and filters, you could get access to those. Let me see if we have that here. Just a second. So yeah, we have a few. So we have a single, I think, just one test rule that I have created here to divert some messages from one folder to another, but it could be a lot more comprehensive. So to reiterate this mailbox rule acquisition, now we have for Gmail, G Suite, Exchange Office 365 through Exchange Web Services API, and Graph API that covers Microsoft consumer accounts on Office 365. So this comes in handy when doing incident response type of work, and you can look at what inbox rules and mailbox filters a bad actor might have set up on a mailbox to perhaps divert messages or do something with them. So let's see here. Let's talk a little bit about Remote Authenticator while we're here. You'll remember that you downloaded through this download link within FEC, but we changed that now, and instead of giving you a hot link that'll just start the download, we direct you to a landing page where we have options to choose between the Windows version and the macOS version of it. Windows version hasn't changed recently. I think last time we updated was in June when we added Graph API. macOS is brand new. We released that yesterday. So this covers recent Mac versions and has approximately the same functionality. So it covers Gmail, G Suite, Exchange Office 365, Office 365 and Graph API. So when you click one of these links, you get access to Remote Authenticator. Launching it, I'll just show you that the workflow is the same as before, but now what has changed is when you do a consumer account, this will still work, and it'll take you to Microsoft's authentication page where you can use an account to log in. Workflow looks just about the same. You save. And you get a token just like what we used to do before for exchange. So size-wise, it's about 5 kilobytes. And then you import this into FEC for Graph API, and you go from there. So let's go and import that. Here, we'll see that we have a token imported for this email address. So when we go ahead with the acquisition here, yeah, we won't be asked to authenticate or enter a password or anything like that. So essentially what we did was we extended our coverage from just Gmail, G Suite, and Office 365 to also cover Graph API. So you have the Microsoft Consumer Account support as well in Remote Authenticator. And for our law enforcement users, you probably noticed that when we do this authentication in Remote Authenticator now, one of the recent changes is that it's entirely browser-based. So we tap into the end user's default system browser. And the benefit of that is that you could leverage an existing login session there to gain access to that person's mailbox in the event that you're running a search warrant or something like that, and they're not cooperative. You could tap in and gain access that way. Now let's look at something else here. So this was Graph API. Before we stop Graph API, I want to talk about something that's easy to overlook. So let's say that we're doing a Graph API acquisition, or essentially any provider, and we set up our acquisition. We log in and we're good to go. But we don't want to acquire the whole mailbox. We just want to get metadata for the time being. So you could do that with FEC now by tapping into that functionality we used to have for acquire metadata for remaining items. But we changed it around a little bit. So now you can trigger that from the get-go. So let's say that I reopen my project that I just created, and instead of starting it, I just hit this acquire metadata link. It'll ask me where to save the metadata, and then it'll actually acquire the snapshots of all those folders in there, put an acquire the audits folder, which makes sense, and then it'll acquire the metadata for them. So when we look at our output, we have a metadata output for all those items in the folders in the mailbox, including some of the common metadata items like the senders, recipients, message IDs, dates, subjects, and things like that. So this could come in handy sometimes. I mean, I wouldn't recommend just running metadata acquisitions on things across the board, because this is still time consuming, and FEC's full acquisitions are so fast most of the time that you don't save a whole lot of time by doing a metadata only acquisition. But sometimes it might be necessary. So it's something in your toolbox, and it's available there if you need it. Now let's move on to Gmail, and I want to show you a couple of things there. One of the new features we have is the Gmail history records. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then talk some more about the different timestamps we have. So the first thing is Gmail history records and what they are and how we access them. Gmail history records are a data point available in Gmail API. And the reason they're created is to make it easier for email clients to sync email accounts. So let's say that you developed an email client software and you're connecting to an end user's mailbox. So the first time you connect, you request all the emails in the mailbox and you categorize them. You probably put them in a database and you're good to go. And then the user closes out of the mailbox or your application, turns off their computer and goes away. And then they come back in a few days and they want to reopen their email client and they want to sync it. So when they reopen after a few days, how do you sync that mailbox into your email client? One way would be to still request everything that's in the mailbox and get a response that's quite huge. and then sort through that and maybe do some comparisons to see what you've already cataloged and what's new. That's not entirely efficient. Another way could be to keep track of the last date that you made a sync and then request from the email provider just the items that are after that date. But that may not be entirely reliable either, and it's not a preferred way. So what Gmail does is it makes these history records available. So as an email client developer, what you do is you do your first sync, and then you keep track of the last history ID of the last item that you synced. And then the next time you're requesting a sync, you send Google that last history ID and you say, hey, give me the history after this point. And Google gives you a list of changes to the mailbox after that point, and you just sync those. Now, what could those changes be? They could be anything from messages being added to the mailbox, messages that are deleted from the mailbox, labels that are applied to messages, and labels that are removed from messages. So it's not just new items, it could be deletions and label changes too. So we're not developers of a traditional email client, so we don't care too much about syncing things, but how this makes me happy is that this gives us some capabilities to build your own audit log in a way by using those history records and kind of using them as breadcrumbs and following that trail to see what happened in the mailbox. Now, well, let's see first how that looks, and then we'll talk some more about what we can and what we cannot do there. So let's tune into our test Gmail mailbox. Charge it out here and put an output folder. Authenticate. All right, so to get access to the history records, you need to go through the pre-acquisition search interface and run a search and preview the results. And the reason for that is, like I said, the history record system relies on a starting point. So you need to specify a certain starting point to request history records after that point. And that point cannot be often cannot be the very first message in the mailbox, because history records don't go all the way back. So to allow you to pick a starting point, we use this existing interface we already had for running searches. So we let you run a search and then pick your starting point visually and go from there. So in this case, I'll run a search for all the recent items that are newer than 1 month and get the results here. So it'll run a quick search and give me what's here within the last month. So I got 181 results, and I'm going to go back maybe a few days here. So when you right click on this grid now, on a specific item on the grid, you'll see a new context menu that says fetch history records starting at this item. So like I said, this is going to start at this item, so at this time approximately, and it'll go forward towards current date. So one of the things they will have to do is FEC will have to acquire some metadata. That's because, number one, we're getting the history records, and then we're getting metadata for the items that are associated with those history records. Because if you just get the history records, they're not very rich. They don't give you a lot of detail about what those records relate to. They just give you some basic information. So we get the records first, and then we get metadata associated with them. Something that you might notice here is that we have 181 items in our entire search. Well, we're fetching metadata for a lot more than that. And the reason for that is it's not a one-to-one relationship. For example, these items that we found when we ran our search are the items that are currently live in the mailbox, but history records could be related to items that are perhaps deleted or their labels have been changed. So there's a lot of different aspects with it than just the live items. That's why the count is larger than just what's in your search results. So FEC is just about done getting the metadata for these items. Let's save them to our output folder here. Let's go take a look. So this is a text file that has little breaks that indicate the specific history records that you're looking at. and it starts, it goes in chronological order. So the oldest item that we picked is first. So this was our starting point. And then you'll follow that it's going down and the dates are getting closer to today. And finally, we are at current date, August 19th. We have a little disclaimer here that, to give you some information on this. And it says essentially that Google's history IDs, based on their documentation, they increase chronologically. So as you get closer to the current date, the history ID gets larger, but there could be gaps in the history records. So that's something to keep in mind. So well, first disclaimer for me here, and that is the history records are very cool, but they don't go back forever. They usually, Google states that they can last anything from, I think, a week or so or more. In my testing, I think about a month is probably a good time to look at. If you look at something that's much earlier than that, then it's just not going to return any results. And if you see, will tell you that you're looking too far back, so you need to come a little closer to the current day. So when that happens, you can pick a later starting point and rerun your history record acquisition. So what that tells me is that this is kind of a fast changing data point. And if you have reason to use this artifact, you have to act fast and secure it before those history records evaporate. So what does this give us that a normal email acquisition doesn't? Well, when you acquire the emails, you see the current state of the mailbox with each item with its current labels and live messages. Whereas here, you see items that are live, you see records of items having been deleted, and you see all the label changes that were applied to items. So it's, like I said, it's kind of like an audit trail. Now, something to be aware of is that not every history record has a date associated with it. Actually, the history records themselves don't have timestamps on them, other than the fact that their IDs are increasing. But what could give you a clue as an anchor point in time is when new messages are added to the mailbox. That gives you timing information. For example, if I look at this history record here, I see that this record is related to messages being added to the mailbox. And right below that, there's information about the specific message that was added, and there's a timestamp of that message that was added. So that gives us timing information. Now, well, let's talk about that a little bit later. So here's another message that was added, so another timing information. And then there's a bunch of activity before that. Let's backtrack here until I find another messages added record, so then we can sweep and cover what happened between. So let's see here. There's a lot of information about associated messages. And then let's search for messages added here. I see one somewhere in here, for example. Let's see. Yeah, so here's another one where messages were added to the mailbox, and the timing is, oh, this is from today, so this is still pretty recent. It says today's meeting notes, for example. So let's trace a little bit and see some of the events that happened before these latest messages that were added. So I see that some messages, at least a message was deleted. So let's follow the journey of the specific message that's represented by this ID. So it goes and starts about here. And we see that a label was removed from this message. So the label, removed label's ID is unread. So the unread label was removed. So the message was marked red essentially. And then the message was moved to trash. So that causes the trash label to be added to the message. When in that process, the inbox label was removed from the message. And finally, the message itself was deleted. So I can trace it from the message ID and see all the actions that have been taken on the specific message. Now, in this case, because this message has been double deleted by the time I got around to acquiring the history records, I do not see the metadata of the message. So I can only tell that a specific message was deleted and I have its ID. So if you had an acquisition or a metadata acquisition or even a history record acquisition from before this event took place, then you can match it by this ID and get the metadata of that message that was deleted. But if you're doing it post-mortem, then you're not going to see what that message was that was deleted. Whereas in other actions where, for example, a message that was perhaps marked as unread after it was read, you could see exactly when that happened and still get the metadata of that message that was marked as unread and catch everything that's associated with it. So this is something you should play around with and get comfortable with. I think there are a few nuances, especially in timing information. But like I said, the idea is to sandwich a record between two message added records that have timestamps on them so that you can identify when maybe a message was marked unread after it had been read before, or it was deleted. And this could come in handy if somebody's pretending that they didn't read a message, or if they deleted some emails that when they shouldn't have. For example, that was a litigation hold and they were not allowed to touch any emails and they actually destroyed evidence, and you can see evidence of it here in these history records. So it's something to play with, perhaps do some history record acquisitions from your mailbox or make some changes to some messages and see how that plays. It's like almost a real-time audit trail that, that you can see. Now let's go ahead and acquire these 180 messages and take a look at a few things. Now, you'll see that there's a little error there. That's because when we did the history record acquisition, if you remember, we had that message that ended with 966. We couldn't fetch metadata for that item because that was double deleted and it's just not there anymore. So FEC records that information for your reference. Again, we have the mailbox rules. We just talked about this before for Graph API. And we look at the downloaded items here. So let's check a couple of things. Number one of the things we recently added, and this came about in our community, that we were talking about hidden timestamps in Gmail messages, and we got some information on timestamps hidden in the service IDs for Gmail, as well as thread IDs that have the same format. So now if you see actually decodes those and outputs them when you acquire a mailbox. So you have this message ID date, which is the decoded version of the service ID and the timestamp extracted from it. And then you have the thread ID date, which is the decoded version of this thread ID value. If you haven't seen this, you can read more about this in our blog here. We had a recent article on this where we talk about how this is decoded and where this information came from and all that. So feel free to read about this. But you know, Andres Reinman was the person that shared his findings with me in the community. So we just built this functionality into FEC and wrote up a blog about it. So here are a couple of things I wanted to show you about these message dates. Number one, the thread ID date here is kind of interesting and good to have, because the thread ID is the message ID that carries over from the initial message in the email thread. So if you look at, for example, these two messages here, they share the same thread ID, and is in fact the message ID of the first message in the thread. And the interesting thing about that is the thread ID timestamp carries over from the older messages. So whatever timestamp that first initial message had, everything in its email thread, it's the same thread ID and the same thread ID timestamp. So if you're looking at one message in isolation, you can decode that thread ID and get a timestamp of the beginning of that thread, which could be very good information. Now, another thing is how these compare to what we see in our history records. So let's look at our history record export again. And let me look at this item here, for example. So I'm looking at this message with the date of August 19th at 5:13:49 UTC. So this is going to be the message. That's going to be this message here. Let's go pull up that message and we can see what that looks like. All right, so when we look at this message, we see that the sent date here is that date. So August 19, 2020, 5:13:49 UTC is the origination date of the message. So the header date or the sent date. If you look at the trace information here, the delivery time is actually 10:14:01. So that's the information that you would see in the message ID, and if it is the parent message in the thread ID date. So it's important to know the distinction between the origination date and the creation date in the mailbox. That is when Gmail actually received that message. So it went through the hops and landed on Gmail. And another thing that we should be careful about is this: because this timestamp is the origination date of the message, it is still open to manipulation. So just because you're getting it from these history records does not mean that those timestamps are immune from any end user manipulation. So you cannot conclusively say, hey, I have a record here that shows that messages were added and there's a timestamp, and that's absolutely the timestamp that when that happened. But there are two things here that play in our favor, I would say. One of them is the fact that the history record IDs are in increasing order chronologically. So you would be able to spot things that are out of place there. And the other thing is when you're using a specific message as an anchor point. So let's say that I have this message with the messages added information here, and I'm relying on it to determine when some events happened in my mailbox, in my target mailbox. If I'm going to use this message for that purpose, then I have other tools at my disposal to authenticate that message first. So I would take that message, I would run it through the ringer, do a DKIM verification, for example, check all the hidden timestamps in the MIME boundaries and all the areas that you would check in a message. We've done some of those exercises before in the last email forensics workshop. So essentially authenticate your message first and see it in context here, and then you can be confident that this is the message that hasn't been manipulated, its date is correct, and everything sandwiched between this message and some other message added anchor point are the events that took place in that time period. So it allows you to date things essentially. Let's see here. And something else that is worth paying attention to is we don't list this here. Perhaps we should, and we might look into adding that as an additional item here. And that is the internal date that Google returns when you acquire these messages. But we do set that as the file system creation timestamps here. So you can still see that here, which is essentially the same that we're getting from the message in this case. So when you have these MIME acquisitions or MSGs, be careful when you move these messages around, because this is valuable timestamps that you would want to capture in your tools. Same thing for IMAP, and in Exchange, you would also have modification timestamps for those messages. All right, so I think we have about 15 minutes left, and I covered just about everything I wanted to cover here. So I'm going to leave a little bit of time for any questions if you have any. So let's close out of this. I don't see anything in the Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to, let's see. Yeah, so I see something on chat from Ryan talking about the sticky notes and Teams chat and things like that from Graph API versus Exchange Web Services. That's right, that's another distinction. So you're not gonna see Teams chat data, notes and things like that. Teams chat is generally available in the grand scheme of things in Graph API, but not through mail. Whereas in Exchange Web Services, Teams chat conversations become available through the mail API. So that's something that we're going to expand on now. Now that we have Graph API built into FEC, we're going to look into integrating some other Graph API data points like Teams chat, perhaps OneDrive, and Calendar into that Graph API acquisition to paint a more complete picture, just like we did with other provider types. So you should expect something along those lines when we do, for example, currently we do the Gmail and Google Drive revision acquisitions all together. We could do something like that for Graph API acquisition, where you acquire the emails and then you get the email attachments that sit on Drive. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, so I'm assuming all is well and nobody has any questions, so that sounds good to me. If anything comes up that we haven't covered here, feel free to reach out, you know, my email, or reach out via LinkedIn or something like that, and I'd be happy to chat. And thanks for joining again, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.